the President. Please be seated. The court is now back in session. I will hand over the floor to the lead co-lawyer for the civil party to make their closing statements. The floor is yours now.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, Your Honors, after my Cambodian colleagues, I have the honor to speak to you on behalf of the civil parties, and I salute the civil parties with respect. My international colleagues and myself represent them. One nagging question, which is almost an obsession, keeps coming up. Why? During the proceedings before your chamber, the civil parties have publicly asked the accused in their own way and in different ways in the same question. Time has not erased their wounds, but the question is still there. Why? Will we have an answer? I am not sure. To such a complex question, there can't be a simple answer. The civil parties assist us in discovering the true nature of this regime. It existed in secrecy through deceit and organized terror. You, Mr. Nunchia, you, Mr. Kyo Sampan, after accepting to break your silence to answer questions put to you by 15 civil parties who came to testify on the impact of what you did, on that occasion, you used, indeed, their words, and you tried to give your regime and yourselves a human face and to buttress the lines of your defense, which we already know. In your own way, you try to evade the questions, and we must reckon that, by the way. Mr. Nunchia, you acknowledged having been a leader of democratic Cambodia. You even admitted the flaws of that regime. But which flaws? You admitted responsibility, but only moral responsibility. The civil parties, unfortunately, will not know any more than that. Mr. Nunchia, you asserted that you had no executive power, as if separation of power existed during democratic Cambodia. Mr. Kyo Sampan, you were more vocal, and your answers that bore the marks of some compassion for the civil parties, you said, and this is in line with a well-orchestrated defense that you put in place for a very long time, Mr. Kyo Sampan. You pose as a victim of the regime you served for long years. And this was what you say. I knew nothing about it. It was not my field. Everything was hidden to me. I was only an intellectual. I was not useful. Your role during that regime was to try to save your life. And you did succeed, by the way. You even posed as a prosecutor. And you dare ask that those responsible for the heinous crimes that the civil parties were victims of be prosecuted. Mr. Kyo Sampan, for once, be realistic. The facts are there. You are before a court. When we read through your answers to the civil parties, we see that you were a lot more than a puppet president. Before, during, and after the democratic Kampuchea regime, both of you, Mr. Nuon Chia and Khieu Samphan, you were in the party. You followed Pol Pot up to his last days. You were the two men he trusted. Mr. Nuon Chia, you were his alter ego. You never distanced yourself. You never distanced yourselves from him. Who do you think you would convince by evading your true responsibilities? The chamber, the civil parties, the Cambodians? You take your desires as reality. You use your preferred weapons, secrecy, deceit, to justify yourselves. The civil parties will not be fooled by the double game behind your words, which you claim are warm-hearted. Everyone, historians, researchers, experts, did their analysis of the history of democratic Kampuchea. The account of the civil parties is not biased. These are details, hard, precise facts, in spite of the emotions involved, and all shows that your crimes were crimes against humanity. The crimes, like the devil, are everywhere, even in the details, especially in the details. My learned colleague said this morning that the civil parties are contributing to the work of justice, but also to the work of remembrance. There is so much to be said. How can we talk about what was silenced for long years? The heavy mantle of silence was their only means of surviving so many horrors. And yet, in the course of their testimonies, there is a red thread that runs through them, the policy of secrecy and deceit and organized terror, which unfolded through the multiple and similar experiences of the civil parties. It shows the ideology that underpinned the preparation of that revolution and the putting in place of democratic Kampuchea. This trial resituates us in a distant reality. We go back in time, and the civil parties have helped us to do so. They have told us how the terror was organized. We have to backtrack and go back 30 years to understand the history of democratic Kampuchea. Of course, the history of democratic Kampuchea was not written on the 17th of April. We are all agreed on that. The entire history of Cambodia fuels it. There were 5 years of civil war, particularly the unifying struggle to overthrow Lon Nol. But for you, there was a lot more that had to be done than winning the war. There was the revolution. Constructing the nation, which means deconstructing it and reconstructing it according to your ideology. You dreamed of the great leap forward. During the war, walking on the ground was the order of the day, and you didn't want to identify who was doing what. But behind such secrecy, you are already putting in place the structures that would serve as a basis for this exceptional and grandiose revolution. Land collectivization was done in stages. You liberated zones. You know how the peasants are attached to traditions. You didn't want to create any turmoil during that war period. You created cooperatives. We talked about it this morning. According to well-known models, the Soviet and Chinese, not to talk of Stalinist and Maoist models, you used that as support for your revolution. But it was up to your party, the Communist Party, which was the master of the land. They had the possibility of convincing the peasant villagers to support the war and to support the radical change of society. It was fertile ground for your propaganda, and It was a direct means of indoctrinating the peasantry. You instilled in them your ideology. Why did a large number of villagers that you later on referred to or characterized as the base people, why did they reject what you called the new people? Why? The formatting of minds worked very well. They heard for years that the enemy was, above all, the Lon Nol troops and officials, that it was the capitalist perverts living in the cities, and the list goes on. These preparations also enabled the party, even before the 17th of April, 1975, to exert social control on the people, to detect the enemy, and to eliminate them. The social control was only strengthened thereafter. At the time, the party guarded against talking about communism, but they would talk about it later. Why? It is not a crime in itself to stage a communist revolution, to want a better world, equality for all, to construct and defend the nation on new basis. We can't say anything against that. But by what means did you do so? What communism are we talking about? You did not choose to innovate to achieve your magnificent revolution, styled on the Stalinist and Maoist models. You know all the perversions of that model. It was the Cold War. The objective reality is hidden. The statements made in your speeches, as well as those you made on your propaganda radio stations, speak volumes. There were some ambivalent statements that may show that the ideology was subservient, but you did not show your true colors. For 5 years, the party had a smokescreen, the Grunk, which stemmed from the unholy alliance in which the various protagonists had something to gain. For the prince, it was the hope to be reinstated in his rightful place in the nation, and for the Khmer Rouge to gain credibility. Many Cambodians told themselves that if the prince supports the Khmer Rouge, there is hope. We'll jump up the bandwagon. Many of them, as a result of such traps, joined the Khmer Rouge, only to realize too late the trap into which they had fallen. We heard some of those regrets before this chamber. This is the wave on which you served, and these are the lies through which you advanced. And you know, Mr. Kyo Sampan, you were in charge of projecting this reassuring image abroad. The stage was set as early as the 17th of April 1975. Deceitful secrecy and organized terror, hallmarks of a totalitarian regime. You wanted to eradicate the culture of the people. On the 17th of April, the Khmer Rouge army entered Phnom Penh. It was victory. The leaders were not leading their troops. Where were they? The people saw soldiers frowning, indifferent. But the people somewhat rejoiced because they thought peace had returned, the war was over. And it did not really matter to them who the victors were. Some information filtered through since the overthrow of the prince, not only on the fighting between the official army and the Khmer Rouge, but also on what was happening in the rural areas. Rumors ran rife. They suspected something. Let us play the game, even if it means backcycling. That is what the city dwellers said. we are Cambodians, we will succeed in the end. And they gave you the benefit of the doubt, which you would never give them. These urban dwellers could not imagine what was going to happen to them. Contrary to the analysis that Mr. Nuon Chea appears to make, your troops did not liberate a population that was imprisoned forcibly by the Long Nol government. People who had rallied behind your cause. They were entering enemy territory. They had received orders. They were programmed to execute your plan, the evacuation of the entire population of Phnom Penh. Your regime started with deceit on the 17th of April, and it continued to function through lies, and after your defeat, you continue to lie till date. Deceit was one of the preconditions for the functioning of the regime you established. You remained rooted in your ideology. You thought that you were going to usher in a utopia in Cambodia. You refused reality. You denied it. Deceit goes hand in hand with secrecy. For Philip Short, an expert who testified before this chamber, and which the defense quotes profusely in his briefs, he says, and I quote, "Deceit remains a major hallmark of your regime. It was an instrument of power. And as I said earlier on, it is one of the hallmarks of totalitarian regimes. You were the victors, and you moved forward with your masks. On the day of victory, you showed what the city dwellers meant to you. These city dwellers were paralyzed by the call to evacuate the town. We've heard the same reasons given by the men dressed in black and khaki who ordered the people to leave immediately their homes. Leaving the town for 3 days because there were risks of American bombings. We talked about that. You said it was necessary to clean up the town. When we know the double meaning in the phraseology of the Khmer Rouge, we understand what clean up could have meant. You subsequently gave another reason for this evacuation of Phnom Penh. Famine. My learned colleague talked about it also. You gave many sources of information, but these were all false pretexts, as Philip Short also told us. In fact, 2 million people were on the streets in April without water, without food, without shelter for days on end. Was that your way of solving the problem of famine? It is all the more strange that you argued that Cambodia was facing a disaster following the war and the American bombings. No one will say that the country was flourishing, that the American bombings did not have tragic and lasting effects on all these zones. But when we follow your reasoning, we find that they had nothing absolutely to eat everywhere in Cambodia. So what were you going to do with 2 million people who were wandering on the roads and in the rural areas? You wanted to leave them to die of hunger? No, you say, that was not our intention. Fortunately, the bombings hadn't affected the entire country. The inhabitants of Phnom Penh, especially those who didn't die on the roads, found some food in cooperatives after drifting for days on end. They managed to find something to survive on. But the question, no less pressing, what do they want of us? Why? Why? Your answer today is that you were all Cambodian citizens apart from some traitors, soldiers, and feudalists. The rest of the people were not the enemy. Yes, we evacuated you. It was general and systematic. That is true. But we had no evil intentions. Everyone was evacuated. There was no discrimination. Apart from the witch hunting of members of the former regime, some of whom were eliminated on the spot, the number is a lot higher than what Mr. Kyo Sampan gave in radio messages and even what the prince said. All the inhabitants were evacuated. You call them the new people. They were not the ones who gave themselves that name. The civil parties did not stop saying that when we got to the villages or even on the roads, they heard the Khmer Rouge and the villagers calling them the 17 April people, the new people. That was the official name. You built up an entity apart. You created a group apart. You separated them from the masses on which you based your Marxist revolution. There was no working class in your country, so you logically relied on the peasantry. You created an apartheid system in Cambodian society, even though the base people did not enjoy all the individual freedoms. They still had some rights. By the way, they were called full rights citizens. You are the ones who created that category. The new people, the evacuees, were called the deposed. You said there were no political groups, but you created that group. You don't have to be a member of a party to be a politician, regardless of the various activities of the citizens. You were the leaders of democratic Cambodia who stuck that label on them. You are the ones who created that group, a group that was essentially and globally an enemy. We were always suspected. We were the new people in principle. We were considered as the enemy, the civil parties state. These citizens, you robbed them of their identity, whether they were traders, professors, or rickshaw drivers. Everyone was put in the same boat. It is true, you did not make any distinction between the new people. All the new people were discriminated against. That initial evacuation marked the beginning of the dehumanization of the people. The new people became people without rights. You even deprived those citizens of their citizenship. They were forbidden to participate in the National Assembly elections in 1976. The base people enjoyed that right. I must say that one can smile sadly when we think about those elections, an assembly that was created to keep up appearances. The cards of the party disguised themselves as a dream team of workers on paper to stage the revolution. This shows the extent to which your lives went. Mr. Nonchia, this is how you were elected President of the National Assembly. Mr. Kyo Sampan, you had just been appointed President of Democratic Cambodia. You are aware of that. You know about those elections. Nothing was hidden to you. The new people, therefore, lost their citizenship. Now, what were your objectives? To destroy them? No, you say. To re-educate them. There were losses. That is not your problem. For you, that was a collateral effect of the evacuations. How many people were arrested and eliminated? How many were going to be called traitors, so-called re-educated persons who never reappeared? You still use the same methods, secrecy and lies. Regarding those who disappeared, Mr. Kyo Sampan, you find that the civil parties are not convincing on that subject. Hundreds and hundreds of people disappeared during the first and the second evacuations, when thousands of people end up disappearing and do not resurface more than 30 years later. In the context of the then democratic Cambodia, what conclusions would you draw? They disappeared. They are dead. These husbands, these wives, these brothers and sisters, these uncles, these aunts, these cousins, these friends, these neighbors, these unknown people all disappeared. You viewed these new people as a block and not as individuals. Today, you acknowledge that the people suffered, but that was not systematic and widespread, you say. You quote civil parties who had the sincerity to say what they had experienced. They do not lie. Yes, some of them were luckier than others. They stumbled across more viable cooperatives or came across chiefs who were less austere and villagers who were more welcoming. Some were treated less severely than others. In the pages that you quote, a lot is said about dehumanization during the first evacuation, the loss of identity. They were hoping to eat a bit more, and they underscored the fact that these differences show that the situation was not completely bleak. You try to shield yourself from legal responsibility and blame it all on the low-level card. You were the leaders. You were the center, all the same. The revolution was advancing behind a mask, that of Ankara. We did not have any idea about what it was, but later on we understood that it was the organization, one civil party says. We wondered what Ankara wanted of us, another civil party said. You were Ankara. You looked the other way in order to protect yourselves. You were afraid of losing your powers. You turned a blind eye in order to terrorize the people. This is what one of the civil parties, who was not a member of the New People, said. This is a civil party who had known your comrades, Pol Pot and Ieng Sary, when they came to seek refuge in his region, Ratanakiri. He had been promoted village chief, but he's one of those disappointed with the revolution. He almost ended up in S21, and this is what he stated. There was nothing greater than Ankara. You could not escape Ankara. Even if you had flown into the skies or sought refuge in the fish ponds with the fish, you would not have eluded Ankara. With this poetic flourish, he conjures up the true identity of Ankara. In the last quarter of 1975, Ankara announced through its subordinates, either diplomatically, that is, through lies, or authoritatively through violence. They announced the evacuations towards the north, towards the northwest. That was the beginning of the second population movement. A number of new people accepted the transfers. It was mouth-watering. They dreamed of rice granaries, eating to their fill, going back to their villages. Some were more reticent, and they were strongly brutalized. Some were even executed. There were other false reasons they used to make the people to move. You are going to go back to Phnom Penh. Ankara needs you. Some of them registered. And those who had the fortune not to be eliminated on the way realized very quickly what the lies were. The decision of Ankara was part of a policy established by the leaders. The objective was not humanitarian at all. The objective was to produce more, to build a country, to increase rice production, and to achieve the 3 tons per hectare. That was the beginning of enslavement. For several months, those transfers were organized. Thousands of people, the new people, were sent to the northwest. The same who had been victims of the first population movement, people who are traumatized, famished, they found themselves on the journey to the so-called El Dorado. Men, women, children, the elderly, no distinction. Why? But the base people remained in their homes. The civil parties gave irrefutable evidence of the way decisions were taken at the top. The objectives of the leaders enslaving the evacuees, who were the new people. There were new individuals. There was a mass that had to be transferred. The planning of the transfers was meticulous. Everything was organized fully, well structured, and everything was foreseen. They say that the Khmer Rouge leaders had lists that had been approved by the leaders. It was impossible to amend them. One Khmer Rouge told someone who didn't want to move, the order is from above. Some of them remained behind for several days, waiting for the Khmer Rouge to rally all the 17 April people. All those who were transferred, all those who were moved, were registered at the point of departure and on their arrival. If the orders hadn't come from the center, it would have been completely impossible for those people, those thousands of people, to cross the country. They were not the local leaders, the little chiefs who took the decisions. It was indeed the leaders. The population movement was systematic and widespread. It was discriminatory and affected only part of the population, those you call the new people. Hundreds and hundreds of people were heaped up in ox-driven carts, sometimes in pickups, with their small bundles in the rain, in the blistering heat, and they had to move from one village to the other and again from another village to another. The number of evacuees kept increasing. They were again piled up in trucks. You were afraid. We were afraid of being separated from our families, some civil parties said. The trucks were packed full of people, 100 people per truck. They ran without any care for us. The women and children died. Later on, their bodies would be thrown on the roadside by the Khmer Rouge and abandoned. One civil party stated, why waste time with the 17 April people? Some of the trucks went across the ghost town of Phnom Penh. In one truck, a little voice is heard. Papa, are we going back home? Papa, why aren't there any people? What could the father of that child have said? He remained silent. That child was not the only child to ask such questions to his parents. Why? Other 17 April people were piled up in boats that had to take them to Phnom Penh. The cry of joy of one man who caught sight of the town cost him his life. Any manifestation, even of joy, could be tolerated by the captain of the boat. He had received orders to steer that boat to its destination, and the only way to keep the boat stable and to keep his cargo on board was to eliminate anyone who was to cause trouble. After waiting for long, they took trains to Persat, heading for Battambang. The trucks were loaded with evacuees without any consideration, guarded by soldiers. Some had received rice cans, no water, nothing, no toilet facilities. The doors of the wagons was open, but a plank barred it, and it was guarded by soldiers. Women and children died, the bodies were thrown on the tracks, and they were picked up by railway workers, as one of those railway workers testified before this court. The evacuees kept track of the direction. The trucks headed for Battambang, but all of a sudden they turned left and they were dropped in a place they had never imagined. None of the evacuees arrived where they had thought they were going. They were exhausted. They hadn't eaten anything. They were shocked by the violence of that evacuation, by the dead, by the dehumanization of the new people who now found themselves in transit camps and were again registered. There were thousands of people who were herded by the Khmer Rouge, by civilians in black clothes, and they kept hoping for a final destination, which would only be a corner in the jungle. And one soldier, to cheer up the civil party, said, "You will stay here forever." This led people to real hell. And it reminds us of other movements in other places. This only shows another stage in our destruction as a new people. These evacuees met with the worst living conditions they could never have imagined it. Nothing had been put in place for them. They have to build their huts themselves and live on meager rice rations. Children are separated from their parents. They are sent to mobile units or groups of very young children. Everyone has to work. They work according to insane schedules. And then you have to add self-criticism meetings, and dysentery and malaria would further blacken the picture. And for medicines, all they had was rabbit pellets that were supposed to cure everything. And coconut juice was often injected to people with fatal effect. We were treated worse than animals. You, sirs, you never went to visit those places. You cannot claim that you did not understand under what conditions those people were evacuated. Those new people. It was not the little chiefs who organized those population movements. They obeyed your orders. They followed your plans. You turned a blind eye to all that. They had to produce 10 tons of rice. They had to dig dikes, build canals and dams. Mr. Nonchia, you nevertheless went to the provinces. You availed yourself of your trips, according to your bodyguard, to visit cooperatives. You don't seem to have been worried by the working conditions in those places. You could not change them. Neither could you punish those who did not follow your orders. At the 1st January dam, you studied the question of defects, but under those inhumane conditions, you did not do anything. You did not do anything to help improve those conditions. The working conditions of those robots we saw on our screens. Mr. Kyosampan, you went to the Ma Dam with the prince. You were even carried away by this great dam, I quote you, but you didn't ask any questions. You knew that that dam was built by hand and not by machines. What happened was in line with your ideas regarding relations between the individuals and the state. The only thing that mattered was the interest of the nation. Individuals did not matter, did not count. The individuals were erased. Your nation was a slave state that you had approved, that you had organized, as Philip Short recognizes. All these innocent people, all these evacuees, these news people were imprisoned in a warless prison, famished, tortured, subjected to forced work. They have no control over their lives. Why? Because they remained enemies, because they were unclean. And you lumped them in the category of the deposed, and they would never come out of it. The regime of democratic Cambodia created a singular situation, an exceptionally severe communist system that used exceptional measures to destroy the identity of the people and to transmute it. Now, why do they talk of the Cambodian genocide? Mrs. Tuch Pandarasa, civil party, specified that one of her children died during the genocide. You heard about it here. Mr. and Mrs. Chai, civil parties, also referred in their complaint to genocide. Why does Mr. Sinishamberg say spontaneously that it was a genocide? That researchers, sociologists, journalists, artists studied this question of the covered-up genocide. The question keeps coming up. When we talk of the Cambodian people, Schoenberg writes, inventing a group and viewed as different, dangerous, toxic, that must be destroyed. Is that not the definition of genocide? End of quote. The civil parties all talk about the genocide, but we will not talk about it up front. This question remains a legal issue, and in this particular trial, you are not charged with genocide. And the chamber expressly limited the scope of the trial. Dehumanization killed both the living and the dead. The civil parties expressed the pain they felt in realizing that their close friends and relatives were not buried. The dead were dehumanized before their death and after their death. No traditions, no social rituals for the burial of the dead. You have to take risks to do so, some said. Bodies disappeared. Where are they? Interred in huge mass graves. On the sites at which they were executed, everywhere, death was covered up. There are no crimes. We are still in this duality, secrecy and deceit, which is a hallmark of your regime. You had to efface the reality in order that it shouldn't exist. But in this trial, the civil parties came with their dead. They are disappeared. It is a symbolic return to life for the living and the dead. All gave evidence of the crimes committed. Mr. President, Your Honors, during these proceedings, you have given back the voice to the civil parties, this voice that had been buried. This voice bears fruit, and you will find that in your deliberations. History and justice are intertwined in crimes against humanity. You are judges. You will not recount history. You are going to fill a void by your judicial act, by the delivery of your judgment. You will answer, even if partially, to this question: why? How did this happen? How was it possible for this to happen? The civil parties are waiting for your decision with impatience, even though they know that the delivery of a guilty a conviction will not answer all their questions, but it would at least be a guarantee for the future of Cambodia. I thank you.
President, thank you. Yes, you may proceed, the international lead co-lawyer.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon to you. Good afternoon, Your Honours. Good afternoon to my colleagues and everybody present here. Once again, in this trial, it falls to me to bring an interlude devoted to the civil party to a close and to make some kind of summary and perhaps to raise some signal points which have emerged in the discussions we have held and which have been referred to in the submissions by various parties. And perhaps I will try and draw some conclusions, but I'd like to start perhaps by sharing a sort of secret with you. When I came into this room for the very first time, about 3 years ago, and sitting opposite me I saw the 4 accused, more than 35 years after the Khmer Rouge came to power. For a few seconds, I wondered if I was doing the right thing. And then, straight away after that, I thought of those other people, at least as old as them, or they would have been, but they died between 1975 and 1979. And I thought of those people who were not elderly at the time, but who became it between 75 and 79. Those who, aged 25 or aged 30, lost their hair, their teeth, their strength, and their health under the Khmer Rouge regime. I thought of those who survived and who took their seats here behind us every day, who are advancing towards old age, or who are already elderly, like the accused. And I said to myself that, of course, it is to them, in particular, to the victims, that we owe the greatest possible respect, the deepest compassion, and most certainly justice. I don't regret having had that doubt for a few seconds, of 3 years ago almost. After all, doubt belongs to the arena of justice, and it endows it with value, starting from an initial doubt and reaching certainty, the conviction that comes at the end of the process. In a criminal trial, the accused have rights, and quite rightly so. They are the ones under the limelight, and their rights are constantly safeguarded. Today we are living a key moment of international justice, and it's a very important moment in this trial as well, because for an entire day it is the victims who are in the limelight, and it is their rights that are equally respectable and fundamental that are being highlighted and protected. As I rise to speak, I think of all of the people who have come day after day to this public gallery here during 214 days, attentive, sometimes reduced to tears, sometimes angry, sometimes drowning under abstruse legal debate, but all of them always expecting something that they knew to be deeply important. And I speak for those people who came to look for a truth, an explanation, an answer, a meaning, however imperfect and incomplete. I speak for young Cambodians that we have seen sitting here with us so often, many of whom made the brutal discovery in the space of 2 hours of an episode in their history of family tragedies and of events that were more violent and inhuman than they were able to imagine. Now, I know that these young Cambodians now have to face up to a future with this as their past, but not as a weight they have to bear, still less as some kind of blame they carry, but rather as a lesson that they should not forget. I stand especially for the civil parties who, more than 5 years ago, took the choice of playing an active part in this trial, choosing to represent all the other victims, the survivors, and those who died. I stand and speak for those civil parties that certain other parties to this trial still refer to as witnesses, although with their will to bring evidence and play an active role. The civil parties are very different from witnesses. It's almost as if people didn't want to call the prosecutors prosecutors. And I speak now, as my colleagues before me, for the civil parties. And let me tell them, here and now, how honoured I am to defend them, and how much I admire them for their courage, loyalty, and their resolve. I know how much it must have been tough for them to go into the minute details of what they went through. How much that must have opened the old wounds that have never really healed. And I know how painful and repugnant it can be to be questioned on minute details, and how difficult it must be to have the feeling that you're not being believed when you talk about these acts and these events. And I speak for those who are dead, those who in a sense found new life through the words of others, the civil parties, for a few instants in this courtroom. And I hope that this trial will return to the dead their full dignity. This trial is perhaps not exactly what we wanted it to be. There are no more than 2 accused. The months have gone by. Civil parties and victims have passed away without seeing the end of the trial. There are a great many civil parties, witnesses and experts who were not even heard. So these proceedings may not make it possible to try other facts than the first forced transfers and Twelpo Chley, for reasons that all the parties present are aware of. The Chamber and the parties know this. There is the question of the health of the accused and, of course, financial issues. These are parameters that have been there ever since the ECCC was set up. They're a kind of risk that we willingly accepted to take. And as I see it, we were right to do so. This trial might leave a certain bitter taste behind it, resentment, pain for some people, because it will not possibly satisfy all of the expectations. Some people have already expressed their disappointment. Others have lost interest, and others, again, will do so, because it is true that justice, like any human enterprise, cannot meet the entire range of expectations and desiderata. But, despite this, this will not have been a pointless trial. It will not have been in vain, whatever the outcome. It will have been a meaningful and positive process. It will have been a place for thought, for truth, for questioning, for emotion, analysis, explanations, and proof. In other words, it will have been what it should have been, which is a venue for the work of justice. And today we are coming towards the end. And this is a final moment where the civil parties can take the floor. And they have 2 objectives. First is to have the culpability of the accused for the crimes that they have been discussing for the last few months recognised, and in this we of course support the prosecution. And then there is the question of recognition of the injuries they have suffered as a result of those crimes, and the recognition of the harm they have gone through, along with the necessary reparations. Let me try one final time to paint a picture of what it is that you are going to be judging through the eyes of all of these victims. Through what you have just heard, the facts that have been described to you by my colleagues before me, I want to stress to what extent the forced movements of the populations and the executions at Twelpo Chley are, in fact, emblematic of the entire democratic Kampuchea regime. I want to stress the extent to which you can see in these events everything that will define the entire regime. That is what we are able to see, I would say, with the benefit of hindsight. Because simultaneously I want to point out the degree to which for the victims, at that time, those events defied the imagination and exceeded the bounds of reason and comprehension. The first unbelievable event was this evacuation of Phnom Penh, which still today the inhabitants describe with pain and disbelief. As you have heard, it wasn't the first evacuation. In Phnom Penh, people had probably heard about what was happening in the zones occupied by the Khmer Rouge. As my colleague said this morning, they had heard about Kampong Cham, Udong, and other towns. They had been told that they had been evacuated when the Khmer Rouge had stormed them. There was some talk of violence and executions, but nobody really believed it. They did not want to, and they could not. Indeed, how can you believe that Cambodians can take such pains to empty their own towns of their own citizens, right down to the last citizen, in that way and with those objectives? Because when the soldiers come to their houses and turf them out, people leave as quickly as they can under the threat and gripped by fear and panic. In 3 days, the town was emptied. Only 3 days was needed to force more than 2 million people to march off to the four corners of the country. The people from the northern part went towards the north, those from the east towards the east, those from the south to the south, and those from the west towards the west. More than 3 million people. Ritipan, who was a victim of the regime, says in his book, The Elimination, I know today that speed is a decisive factor. It doesn't seem important, retrospectively speaking, but we didn't have the time to be fascinated or even convinced. We were immediately moved. Famished, separated, and terrorized. Deprived of the right to speak and of every other right. We were just broken. We were submerged in hunger and fear. My entire family disappeared in 6 months. End of quote. There is no better way to state what the 17th of April really represented. It was the first population movement and emblematic of the regime as a whole. It was so effective and radical, so swift and absolute in its outcome, that you would need to be pretty dishonest to claim that the details of its implementation are the fruit of isolated behavior by a handful of petty chiefs. The same words, the same orders, the same reasons quoted and the same threats when reason didn't work were used everywhere in the same way throughout the entire city, and the people fled. Without any doubt whatsoever, this evacuation had been carefully prepared and thought over and experimented on in smaller towns. These people who left Phnom Penh marching with the April sun beating down had no idea of what was happening to them. In fact, they didn't yet know that it wasn't for 3 days and that they weren't going to be coming home any time soon. They did not yet know that at that precise moment, the Khmer Rouge were setting up the glorious socialist revolution that they had been dreaming of for so many years. and that they were going to be doing this through every possible method available to them. These people tramping down the roadways did not know that they were caught in a plan that had been hatched months and even years ago, that the evacuation of the cities and the forced displacement of their inhabitants was only the first and vital phase of a huge criminal plan of which they were the victims. They have not yet lost hope. They think there might be a chance of coming back to their homes, perhaps to be able to lend their skills to the new regime, to find a place in it, and of course to live in peace. They don't yet know that this criminal plan is already in place. Everything has been thought through, even written down, and in the zones that have been occupied for several years, everything is already working. They don't know that at the top, those leaders, two of whom are here now, are preoccupied to make sure that their glorious revolution comes to fruition at any price. And they don't know that they're going to suffer a great deal more, and for years. They don't yet know, during those 3 days, that the days are going to become weeks, and the weeks are going to become months. They discover death, killings, destroyed pagodas, strange identity checks where they understand that they have to tell lies. Everything that you have heard about earlier this morning, and they don't understand it. And when finally they're allowed to stop, they believe that their torments might ease off. Some of them get small rations of rice. They believe that they are going to be able to make do by following orders that are given to them with the same words and the same ideas in all of the villages where they wash up. They all believe the same things because they all hear precisely the same things from the small local chiefs who are so adept at relaying the orders from the top. And then comes the second forced transfer. It was perhaps this second forced transfer that finally makes them understand that they are no longer anything but objects and tools, part of a vast plan which has them in its grasp since the very first hours in Phnom Penh. The second forced transfer shows in an extremely symptomatic way exactly how the High Command, Angkar, continues absurdly and with incredible stubbornness their criminal plan. They know that in the northwest there are serious problems connected with shortage of food, specifically for the new people. And the senior leaders of Phnom Penh, and who went to check things in situ in August 75, people who have been given very clear reports on the subject, decide there and then to send to the northwest hundreds of thousands of people, principally the vast majority of them being people of the new people. This was essentially to satisfy production targets that common sense dictates were totally unachievable, and that is why the people were moved. You don't need to do a thesis on economics to know that these targets were unachievable, and certainly not with your bare hands and no tools. The aim, of course, was to wipe out any traces of opposition, any kind of independence or liberty. It was basically to wipe out the enemy. So, what do all these men, women, elderly people and children matter to the people who are putting their plan into practice? And my colleague has just told you how the senior leaders organized this second population movement with remarkable precision. They send each other telegrams, organize meetings, move undesirable people from one region to another, such as the Cham. They measure tons of rice and the number of dams that they can generate. The Cambodians are taken in the south, the southwest and the centre, and they're sent off to the northwest as if you were moving cattle or agricultural machinery that were lacking here or there. And as we have heard, once again, they were lied to. They were told, you will have more food. You're going back home to Phnom Penh. And then they were, as she told us, crammed into boats, trucks, goods trains, cattle wagons. They have no right to get out or to complain. They have no water, no food, no care, and no shelter. They drink the same stagnant water that they wash themselves in, and along the railway line they die. So these same people who originally left Phnom Penh are now people who are exhausted, famished, and people who don't look at each other as human beings, in fact, who describe themselves as animals, as monkeys, and who are moved again and again with no regard for their dignity, for their humanity, or for their freedom. They're discarded, dumped in the middle of nowhere, left to their own devices, eating leaves, roots, watching their children die in the cold and in the rain. Then, and only then, they begin to understand something of the plan that they are a part of. They can distantly make out the ghastly purpose, even if they don't dare to put it into words, because it is unsayable. They do know that they've lost all human value in the eyes of the leaders of the regime, and that they don't count, because fundamentally they remain enemies, and they now know that they will be exterminated, smashed, pulverized, if they do not bend to the requirements of the glorious Angkar. And then comes Twelpo Chre. It's a sort of lesson meted out, a kind of event which serves and as an example. And there will be other massacres that serve as examples. Some have already taken place during the evacuation of the cities, and they will take place here and there throughout the entire regime. And the 20,000 mass graves discovered throughout Cambodia give us some measure of this. In Twelpo Chre, all the pieces are there of this criminal plan which is being pursued by the leaders. Deceit to bring people together, secrecy, extermination of the enemy without any kind of qualm. Here the victims are military and officials of the former regime. And then the bodies are piled up without being buried, stacked up in a hideous human carnage. Witnesses spoke about bulldozers that were then brought in to hastily cover up this excessively visible evidence and the unbearable stink. Nunchia says in his final submission that nobody directly saw any killing taking place and that therefore it didn't happen. People have come here to describe the entire process that led up to that extermination, just right up to the minutes before it, and others in a film that was tendered into the debates, the execution itself. Others described the dead bodies heaped up, attached one body to the next, which they saw the next day. And the mass grave was discovered. But as far as Nunchia is concerned, it didn't happen. During these three episodes, between 1975 and 1976, you can see everything unfolding of this criminal plan and its objectives. But still today, there is a kind of inability to believe that this happened, especially among the victims. And the question comes up again and again, how? How is it possible that this happened? Well, the accused do provide us with one explanation if we look at the speeches they were giving at the time. Several times during our discussions here we have heard it said that the petty cadres, the low-ranking military chiefs, killed and tortured and starved people through their own initiatives. People in particular belonging to the 17th of April group, the new people, Nunchia and Kyosampan, both made this argument, saying that they were completely ignorant that this was happening, or even that it had happened at all. Repeatedly, they told us that they did not know about this, that they weren't told about this, and this was not what they wanted for the people of Cambodia. When in 1979 the entire world discovered S-21, Kyosampan, president of the State Presidium of Democratic Kampuchea and subsequently Prime Minister and then Vice President responsible for foreign affairs, he didn't know anything. Well, he'll have to watch the film which Ritipan brought out in 2003, apparently, to understand the existence of S-21. That, at least, is what he claims. He says these things flying in the face of the evidence. From the moment the forced transfers begin, the same orders and threats are issued everywhere. There's one evacuation and then a second one, both of them carefully organized according to a pre-established plan. The same words are heard everywhere, the same messages, the same terms are used by the cadres everywhere, in all of the cooperatives, to begin with those very symbolic terms of 17th of April and new people. And it's done to systematically empty the towns and displace the population once again. And it's also done to encourage former soldiers or officials or teachers or monks to go to this or that place. And the same tricks are used as were used in Tuolpo Chre. And the same objective is to be found everywhere, to exterminate this multiform enemy so that there can be no further obstacle to the great and swift socialist revolution. And for that to be possible, you need somebody at the top who is in charge, who is guiding everything. You need propaganda and you need decisions that are relayed everywhere. And that group at the very top exists. And of course the cadres always give it its name, Ankar. Nunchia and Kyosampan belong to it. Nunchia, countless times, said that he and Pol Pot were one and the same. He admitted, finally, that he was brother number two. He, Nunchia, was just below Pol Pot, sometimes just beside Pol Pot, and sometimes in his place. As for Kyosampan, he was there, in the meetings, on the podiums, throughout the countryside, transmitting the glorious ideas of the revolution, galvanizing crowds with speeches to the glory of a magnificent revolution, speeches that he, better than everybody else, knew, speeches which describe magnificent achievements, which he knew had absolutely nothing to do with reality at all. In the Aronovics film, which he said that he followed Pol Pot like his shadow. Well, you couldn't put it better. Together they worked to establish all of the conditions necessary for the success of the plan. What were these conditions? Well, as we have heard in the proceedings in this courtroom, first, there was fear. Fear is always a lethal weapon. You just have to spread it everywhere. It wasn't just the 17th of April people or the Cham or the Vietnamese or the intellectuals who were afraid. Fear was everywhere, both within and without the ranks of the Khmer Rouge. A great many witnesses, former Khmer Rouge, almost all of them in fact, came here to say how afraid they were. Fear caused them to not know or pretend not to know what their neighbours were doing. It forced them to behave in a way that to us seems like cowardice, but which perhaps was the only way to survive. All of them said how afraid they were of not doing what they were meant to do, even if they didn't know precisely what was required of them. They all described their fear of knowing too much and of saying too much and of hearing too much. That was the case with Ros Sui, with Sok Chin, with Sim Hao, who said that you had to continue to work and pretend to see absolutely nothing. It was true of Chukrin. Sok Tun, who was very close to Nodja, was also afraid. Bian Kian, who was close to Khoi Tun, he was afraid. Yung Kim, head of a commune and a cooperative, was afraid and said, we were just thinking about how to survive. Rachin Tun, Kipun, close to Pol Pot, was afraid because, he said, a great many high-ranking people disappeared. Num Sem was afraid, quote, even if I did nothing wrong, unquote. Mias Vern, a regimental commander, was afraid and only did what he was told to do. The civil parties also described that fear that was omnipresent from the very start. The entire Cambodian people was afraid, and the glorious revolution was rooted in fear. That fear was disseminated from the very start, from the days they walked into Phnom Penh. That fear, the leaders used it to terrify their closest subordinates, such as Duik or Sonsikun, who told us about that here. Everyone fell into line thanks to that fear, and it was particularly effective because nobody knew quite what you were supposed to be afraid of and why. It stripped everybody of any ability to say no, to resist, or even to voice the smallest criticism. Setting up and maintaining that atmosphere of fear was one of the constant objectives of the leaders of the regime. Just knowing that you could disappear or die was enough in itself. So fear was the primary weapon they used. Then, as well, there was thirst, but more particularly hunger. You can see this as soon as the town people left their homes. Hunger was a vicious weapon that was used throughout the regime, and it was so effective, it became so obsessive, that it denied people any ability to think and to act for any other purpose than that of surviving. You just had to stay alive. When you listen to the 17th of April people's narratives, you can see that hardly were they out of Phnom Penh, hunger became a permanent preoccupation which worsened as the months went by and which became a physical and psychological torture at every moment. They describe that hunger as being an obsession and a cause of sickness and death. They describe how, bit by bit, their 3 days of supplies run out and how powerless they are to meet the needs of their children. They describe the deprivations which turn into fatal torture. They describe the inadequate food and the bad quality of the food they are given, which is like animal fodder. They describe how they eat roots, leaves, the most disgusting insects just to survive. They also describe how hunger completely debases them. the way their bodies are destroyed, total loss of any strength, the entreaties of their dying children, and they describe their parents dragging themselves feebly with their rice bowl in their hands. But this hunger, like fear, was very carefully orchestrated from the very earliest days, from the moment the population was moved, and perhaps actually from before, when the Khmer Rouge prevent the river convoys from reaching Phnom Penh to feed a population that was bloated by tens of thousands of refugees. So if these population movements were obviously part of a plan, it is also perfectly obvious that no steps were taken to provide any kind of support to the population during those movements, for example, by distributing enough food. That, too, was part of the plan. After that, the distribution of food would continue to be wholly inadequate and become part of a running blackmail. No work, no food. That was part of the plan as well. In his final submission, Nun Chia scrupulously picked up on each extract from the civil party's statements where they refer to a ration of rice they have got, or a single meal that miraculously was sufficient, in order to claim that people had enough to eat. Well, of that argument I think the Chamber will make what it will. During all of that time, at the very top, the leaders, who were never hungry during the entire regime, were organizing banquets and managing massive exports of Cambodian rice abroad. And we've seen photos in this courtroom of the warehouses full of sacks of rice, and heard witnesses describing the same boats that were loaded up with the same sacks of rice. We've seen documents from the leaders, and we have seen photos of some very healthy-looking senior leaders. When the second forced transfer took place, people were already famished, and this was even before the end of 1975. Before they left, they were told about an area they were going where they would eat better, and people sometimes in this courtroom said how comforting it was to think that perhaps they would have enough to eat. And then they also described the cruel disillusion which followed when they realized that actually it would be worse. Hunger keeps people in a state of permanent weakness. It kills thought. It reduces you to being an animal. That's why it was such a lethal weapon. The next weapon was total material dependence. The people who left Phnom Penh told us how they were told not to take anything, or at least enough things for 3 days only, and those who took more things, money, jewels, provisions, their cars and clothing, told us about how they had to dump them or barter them for rice or medicines. They told us about having their things confiscated or seeing their property destroyed. The people who were chased out of the cities didn't realize this immediately, but behind them, after they left, everything was being destroyed. It's as if this was an unbearable symbol of imperialism for the Angkar, and it was also done out of sheer vengefulness. They didn't realize this straight away, but they had nothing left. No home, no furniture, no memories, no identity documents, nor even the tiniest memento that all of us tend to bring with us. Gradually, they would no longer have any clothing, no longer any bowls or plates, no toys. All they had was one spoon. Having nothing means losing your individuality. losing your autonomy and becoming dependent. The Khmer Rouge were very well aware of this. They who organised this material dependence from the very first evacuations of the cities. And, as if the foregoing is not enough in itself, democratic Kampuchea took great pains to immediately destroy anything that might promote free thought. Intellectuals were hounded and exterminated, of course, but they also dealt with books, works of art, closed down schools. And here I'm talking about real schools, of course, not revolutionary indoctrination centres. Turfing people out onto the road and turning them into tools to perform work, racked with hunger, displaced as and when agricultural and irrigation tasks needed them, is certainly a way of putting an end to schooling. This wish to disallow people any kind of thought also meant eliminating the tokens of it. If you had glasses, then the local chiefs would destroy them everywhere, except, of course, the glasses of the senior leaders themselves. Imagine just how indoctrinated you have to be by a very powerful propaganda machine to be able to accomplish such idiotic acts that were, in fact, repeated everywhere. After having set up these crucial conditions to build their regime, the Khmer Rouge then installed their methods and their instruments. Let me mention one or two. Collectivization, firstly. When people left the cities, they were caught up in this collective existence. There was no home, no family. There was only the group and encart. And there again, that was part of the plan. It's a way of keeping better tabs on everybody. It's a way of preventing any kind of individualism and therefore any kind of freedom. But let me dwell on another instrument used by the regime. And I refer to the change in the language. The language suddenly became extremely warlike. Whether you're talking about cultivating fields, building dams, daily life, family life, everything is expressed in terms of combat and onslaught. In 1976, François Panchaud was very struck by the way the language had been changed. By listening both to testimony from refugees who were using the words of encart and to the radio, he mapped out the meaning of the new vocabulary. It was full of aphorisms, many of which were loaded with aggressive and warlike terminology, and these, in fact, were collected by Henri Locard, and the language uses keywords that are endlessly repeated, such as the term enemy and everything that enemy signifies. Hundreds of official documents echo this word enemy. Enemy from within, enemy from outside. The word is used so much by official propaganda that it will then be employed in all kinds of ways by the cadres at every single level. Everybody had to root out the enemy inside himself or herself. In an atmosphere of enduring fear, that ends up giving exactly what we have all heard about in this courtroom. The enemy is the Vietnamese person, of course, or the CIA or KGB agent, or the person who was part of the Lon Nol regime. But the enemy also becomes the person who breaks the handle of his hoe and thereby demonstrates a desire to be detrimental to the regime, or somebody who doesn't work enough, quoting the wrong reason, such as sickness, a recent delivery, for example. The enemy is the person who picks up a fruit that falls on the ground and which nobody has the right to collect, however young the person might be or however exhausted as well. And it's quite inconceivable that this language that was so widely used was not the language that was wanted and imposed by the senior leaders. The language does have a meaning. The cooperatives become battlefields. The work on the dikes is a military front. Rice production is a battle to be won, as is building a dam. You have to smash, reduce to dust, exterminate, and you have to always maintain a spirit of offensive struggle. Now, in his submission, Nonchair says that this was just a normal way of talking, because after all, they were in wartime and they were moving towards a revolution, and he says that this concerned a system rather than individuals. In other words, he says to us that we shouldn't take this language at face value, but unfortunately everything would indicate that this language should, indeed was, be taken very precisely at face value without any kind of subtle interpretation. This transformation of the language and the words used and ceaselessly repeated was part of the way that people were regimented, and which persuaded them that they were part of a vast battlefield which had, like any battle, to lead to victory. It was a way of hoodwinking people about what was really going on, so that they should forget the means and only see the end. It was a way of galvanizing the group and once again preventing people from thinking and giving new words to what was happening. The language also served to suppress everything that was connected with the individual and personal thought. There was no longer any I, only we. Only the group. It wasn't some kind of haphazard creation, depending on which region you were in. It was the language that was used in official documents, in official discourses, starting by those written by Nonchair and Kyosampan, which dispense orders, threats, and encouragements. And the language was heard, as all languages are. It spread clear, precise, and effective messages, and it was put into effect in a very clear, precise, and effective way at every level. Propaganda was omnipresent, from the highest to the lowest levels, and it was one of the most crucial vehicles. Nonchair told us, in fact, that that was all he was in charge of, propaganda and education. Well, even if that was true, it would be enough in itself, because the propaganda was the crucial basis for the entire regime. It was the way it had to perpetuate itself. Another one of the instruments that were used by the senior leaders of democratic Cambodia were children. Children became a tool, and a very effective one as well. So how, in fact, did they do it to turn these children into such a potent weapon? Well, Duik described it to us in his cold, analytical way. On the 1st of April 2008, he said, I quote, "Children were like a blank page on which you could write what you wanted," end of quote. He told us how he himself selected children one by one from those who didn't have an education, and by using a mixture of gentleness and severity, he was able to make them obey him blindly without thinking, and with enough indoctrination for them not to doubt anything for one instant. And these were the children who came into Phnom Penh on the 17th of April under the leadership of Angkar. They were uneducated, they discovered the city, and perhaps they were afraid of what they could see. People, noise, tall buildings. Much has been said about their blank expressions when they moved through the streets, past the houses, and they were perhaps afraid, but they did have a mission that they had to fulfill, which was to empty the city. And they didn't understand the meaning of this. They didn't know what was at stake, but they were there just to obey, because that was what they had been schooled to do. And they knew that if they didn't do that, they would be punished extremely severely. The child soldiers who evacuated Phnom Penh are among the first victims of the regime. They were also its instrument. We know that the army was made up to a considerable part of children. They were there the first day, and they were used throughout the entire regime, day after day, by democratic Cambodia. They were indoctrinated, marshalled into mobile units and forced to do work. Sometimes they had to stand on stools to control machines. They learnt to disown their families and to denounce their parents. And instead of going to school and learning the kind of things that are called humanities, they absorbed slogans which became the guiding rules of their lives. Khieu Samphan was very proud of this, as expressed in his speech of the 15th of April 1977, when he says, quote, "Our children didn't play with little boats and cars and toy guns. Our children were happy to catch sparrows in the field and tend to the cattle and the oxen, and to collect natural fertilizer and help with the construction of dams and dikes and to dig reservoirs and ditches. They adore work and production, and they're very well trained for manual work and agricultural tasks." End of quote. In the hearing a few weeks ago, on the 4th of June 2013, Khieu Samphan said precisely the opposite to a civil party, that he didn't have the slightest idea that the children were working like adults, and that he could not conceive of such a situation. And then there were the other children, those belonging to the 17th of April families, those who watched terrified while their parents were killed, those who begged not to be separated from their parents, those who were beaten and humiliated, those who stole grains of rice to survive, those who begged their parents for a bite to eat, and those who remained alone. These people too were a weapon. Democratic Cambodia was perfectly well aware that the parents would fight for the survival of their children by working harder, by acquiescing to the most inhuman rules, by keeping their mouths shut.
President, time is appropriate for the break, and before we take the break, we would like to remind the parties and all the support staff who are assisting the trial chamber during this court proceeding, that today we will continue our hearing until 5 p.m. We will now take a 20 minutes break and return at 3:30. The court is now in recess.